my friends are simps.
For today's video, I'd like to introduce you to one of the vintage manual focus lenses from my collection of weird and wonderful photographic obscurities. I'm talking about this wee beauty, the Jupiter 3. This is a 50mm f1.5 lens that was produced in the former Soviet Union between the mid-40s and the late 80s. It was based on an old Zeiss or Zeiss sonar design with 7 elements that the Russians acquired during wartime, and I think the less said about that, the better. This lens comes in a couple of different mounts. The first one is an M39 or Leica thread mount lens. That is a rangefinder coupled lens, and there was also a contact/Kiev mount available. I don't believe that was rangefinder coupled. I've never actually shot with that. I'm only going to be talking about this version, which is the M39, but be aware that if you're looking for one of these, they do come in a couple of different mounts, and you want to make sure that you get the right one. Now, this lens is worth talking about, not for any of its individual specific features or characters, as I'll come on to talk about, but because this is a rare lens where you get a mix of affordability, rangefinder coupling, and also a fairly, well, at least relatively fast aperture. And that is one of the big reasons that a lot of people are interested in these. Maybe they've spent a lot of money on a Leica M6 body and they can't afford to buy, you know, a £3,000 Leica lens, which was definitely the case for me. I'm sure lots of Leica purists will look down on these lenses, and they definitely do. However, these can be a great budget option if you're trying to find a lens to get up and started with your rangefinder body. Because these lenses are LTM mount, you can use them with things such as the Zorky, the Fed series, the Leica LTM series, you know, like the 3A, 3F, etc. But also things like the Canon 7, which used the Leica thread mount standard. And you can also, of course, use them with modern cameras such as the M2, M6, M8, M11, etc. with the relative or appropriate adapter. According to my email records, I have owned this particular lens since 2010, when I paid around $135 or 91 Great British pounds for it. Now, these go for at least double that now. You can find them for cheaper, but the cost will vary greatly depending on the condition of the lens, but also the year and the factory where it was made. There's a whole bunch of mythology online about which factory made the best ones, and you know what coating was used in what place and all that kind of thing. There's also a whole kind of idea around the fact that some lenses have got a red P or pi sign on there, the Greek letter, or I guess the Cyrillic letter for P. These were meant to be some of the best, and of course, you know, because I bought this a long time ago, I was able to get that one a wee bit cheaper than they are now. And I fell into the whole kind of trap of, you know, the mythology. Bought one of them with the red pie. To be honest, I don't know whether it makes any difference at all. If I was getting one of them, I would just make sure it was in good condition and forget about the red symbol, but yeah. So I had this great idea that I would film part of the video using the Jupiter 3 so that you could, you know, see how things are. And I guess the bokeh looks pretty cool like this. However, I forgot that I'm using an APS-C camera, which meant that the 50mm of the Jupiter 3 has now become 75mm or something, and with a minimum focusing distance of 1 meter, which means that, well, in this small space it's not particularly useful. However, I thought I'll go through the specs of the lens whilst I've got this set up, and then we can return to something a bit more practical. You know, I can't even tell if I'm in focus or not. Oh, is that better? Is that better? Fuck it. The camera is so far away just now, it's ridiculous. Anyway, when it comes to the spec rundown of the Jupiter 3, the aperture range goes from f1.5 all the way up to 22. There's a clickless aperture ring in there, which I'm told is useful for video if you're the kind of creative sort that likes to use these annoying old lenses, but I don't think I'll be fucking bothering anytime soon, given the practicalities of this setup. As noted, the minimum focus distance is 1 meter. That's fairly common with rangefinder coupled lenses. You're unlikely to find much lower than that in this format. The filter size is 40.5mm, which isn't the most common, but is also not hugely uncommon. So you can find filters for this. It's just not as easy as, you know, 52 or 55 or some of the other standards. Okay, that's it for now. Let's go back to some autofocus goodness. Oh, okay, this is much better. Let's talk about the performance of this lens. Before I go on here, I have to give you a caveat, which is that I'm not really interested in the technical pixel peeping side of lens reviews. I'm not going to go print off graphs and charts and, compare focuses and all that kind of thing. For me, I'm much more interested in how these old lenses actually work and perform in the wild, as somebody who actually buys these and uses them, or at least used to use them. I've done a whole video talking about why I hate photography now, which you might want to watch. But that's where I'm coming from much more subjective, and you can factor that into what I'm going to say. Now, aside from any specific features of the lens, the main headline when it comes to performance of the Jupiter 3 is that it is all round decidedly average. One of the things that I like to try out with these old vintage lenses is to check out the type of bokeh or the out of focus rendering that you get, because often, even if a lens is a bit shit, it can have some really interesting bokeh and produce kind of effects that allow you to be creative with them. And that is decidedly not the case with the Jupiter 3. The bokeh on here can produce some quite nice glass-like round bubbles or circles, if you will, particularly because the aperture blades keep a nice circle the whole way up and down the range. But I had to work really hard to throw the lens into situations that I knew had a propensity to give me bokeh. In everyday shooting, I didn't really notice particularly creamy out of focus areas. It just didn't, it was nothing special in that regard. So if you're somebody that buys vintage lenses to hunt for bokeh, and in particular old fast lenses, then I wouldn't bother buying this. Now, when it comes to sharpness, I am sure you won't be surprised to discover that the Jupiter 3 is also decidedly average. Now, I have to say that I am not someone that cares about clinically sharp, extra detailed resolution with lenses. I would much rather they have character or, usefulness to them. However, the Jupiter 3 is definitely not particularly sharp. At this point, I do have to say that online there's a whole idea, or lots of people out there that say things like, all of these Jupiter lenses from that era are so soft as to be completely unusable, and that just isn't the case. Even though this isn't the sharpest lens in the world, if you do get it calibrated properly and you do nail the focus, then it can be, reasonably sharp, at least sharp enough for a general all-rounder lens, particularly when shooting on film, and ultimately that's really what this is for. Performance aside, there's a couple of things that you should be aware of with these lenses if you're interested in buying one. The first is the build quality. The condition and build of these lenses will vary greatly depending on which one you get. I've tried out about 20-ish different Jupiter lenses, and I can tell you that all of them have been wildly different from one to the other. Outside of the optics, the two areas in particular that can be a bit shonky are the focus ring. These can get really stiff over time and make operating them quite unpleasant and much more difficult than they need to be. And also the elements can be generally pretty sugary and loose, and I think you can hear on mine that that is the case. Now, you could of course get these calibrated and serviced, and that would go a long way to addressing some of these issues, and you may want to consider getting them calibrated anyway, because originally the rangefinder coupling was calibrated to the Zorky standard, not the Leica thread mount standard, which a lot of the cameras you're going to come across use, and because of that it will be much harder to get these bang on in focus, even if you do get the rangefinder patch completely lined up. And that's of course even more the case if you're going to be using them with an adapter on a Leica M mount camera. The problem with that though is that you're going to spend about £100 odd for the CLA and the calibration, at least actually, and that will add a lot to the cost. And if you consider the price that these are going for now, £200-300, an extra £100, at that stage there are more interesting, better quality lenses that you should probably consider before spending that kind of money. For many years the Jupiter 3 was actually my go-to lens for using with my Leica M2, my Leica M6 and my Leica M8, and the reason for that is simply because it was a cheap, relatively fast rangefinder coupled lens that was also fairly compact. So if I could only take one camera body and one lens, this was a good all-rounder. you know, it would stop down at night so that I could get some dusky scenes, which I couldn't necessarily with an f2.8 lens or something like that. However, as my collection of lenses grew, I also picked up some higher quality lenses, including the Voigtlander 35mm f1.4, and whilst yes, that is a Leica M mount lens, so I couldn't use it on all of my older cameras, it was much higher quality and much better than the Jupiter 3 in every way, especially when I was using it with an M6 or M2 or something like that. But if I wanted to use a Leica thread mount lens specifically, there's also the Canon 50mm f1.2 LTM lens, which is just so much nicer. It's got a whole host of character to it. The bokeh looks beautiful, and yeah, far better than the Jupiter 3. I do have a lot of sentimentality for this lens. I think it's a cool wee thing and a bit of history, but I wouldn't suggest that people rush out and buy it, particularly not at the prices they're going for. I would probably recommend, if you're looking for a lens of this kind of aperture that's also rangefinder coupled, then look at the Canon 50mm f1.4 LTM or the slightly more expensive Canon 50mm f1.2. If price is your main concern but you're still looking for a relatively fast rangefinder coupled lens, then you might want to consider the Jupiter 8. That's a 50mm lens, similar to the Jupiter 3, from the same kind of era, but it's at f2, so there's not too much of a jump between f1.5 and f2, but you can also, most importantly, pick those up for about £40 a lens, and even less than that sometimes if you look around. That means that you could get multiple versions of that lens for a single Jupiter 3, and you can, you know, it's more likely that you can take a chance on one of them, buy a couple of them if you need to find one that's a good quality or whatever else. Even if you have to service that, it's going to be much cheaper than buying one of these things. So hopefully that was interesting. Let me know if you're in the market for a Jupiter 3 or what other weirdo lenses like this you've tried. I'll be dipping into my cupboard of goodies in future to talk more about my lens collection, but for now, see you later.